For 47 minutes, Brandon Swanson remained on the phone with his parents while walking through the darkness of rural Minnesota. Then, at approximately 2:30 in the morning, he suddenly uttered 2 words. "Oh, shit!" The line went silent. His parents immediately called back, but he never answered. This is the disappearance of Brandon Swanson. Brandon Swanson was born January 30th, 1989, and grew up in Marshall, Minnesota, a farming community in the southwestern part of the state. By May 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was a student at Minnesota West Community College in Canby. On the evening of May 13th, Brandon spent the night hanging out with friends at parties in the small Minnesota towns of Lind and Canby before eventually starting the drive home. Friends said he had been drinking that night, but he didn't seem drunk. Shortly after midnight, Brandon began the drive back towards Marshall where he lived. The route normally took him along Minnesota Highway 68, a road he knew well. But for reasons unknown, Brandon chose a different route. Instead of taking the highway, he turned onto a network of rural back roads that ran roughly parallel with Highway 68. Brandon may have wanted to avoid the police after drinking that evening, especially considering he had previously gotten a DUI. Sometime around 1 in the morning, Brandon's car went into a ditch and got stuck near a farmer's field. The car took minor damage, but Brandon wasn't hurt. He attempted to call friends for help, but when no one answered, he decided to call his parents. When Brian and Annette answered, Brandon explained that his car had gotten stuck in a ditch and that he needed a ride home. According to his father, Brandon sounded completely normal, he wasn't slurring his words, and he didn't seem confused. He gave no indication that anything was wrong. His parents agreed to come get him, but as they drove, Brandon began giving directions over the phone. He believed he was near the town of Lind and was confident he knew exactly where he was. Using Brandon's directions, Brian and Annette headed towards the area that he described. But when they arrived, they couldn't find him. Thinking they had simply missed each other in the darkness, Brandon's father began flashing his headlights. Brandon couldn't see them, so he flashed his own headlights from the ditch. His parents couldn't see them either, as frustration began to grow. Brandon was convinced his parents were in the wrong location. At one point, Brandon asked, "Don't you see me?" As the confusion continued, Brandon eventually decided he was tired of waiting. In the distance, he could see the lights of what he believed was a nearby town. Believing it was Lind, Brandon told his parents he was going to walk towards it instead. His parents agreed and remained on the phone as Brandon left his vehicle behind when he started down the gravel road. Neither Brandon nor his parents realized it at the time, but the entire conversation was built on a false assumption. Brandon wasn't where he thought he was. As he continued walking through the night, he remained on the phone with his parents. As he crossed gravel roads, climbed fences, and walked through open fields while making his way towards what he believed was the town of Lind. Then at approximately 2:30 in the morning, something happened. Without warning, Brandon suddenly exclaimed, "Oh shit!" Then silence. The call disconnected. For a moment, Brian and Annette assumed the connection had simply dropped. Brian immediately tried calling his son back. There was no answer. He called again, and again, nothing. Brandon had disappeared. And what investigators would discover in the days that followed would only deepen the mystery. As search efforts began, investigators focused on the area where Brandon believed he had been that night. The problem was, Brandon had been wrong. His abandoned vehicle was eventually located. It wasn't near Lind. It was found near the small town of Taunton, more than 20 miles from where Brandon thought he was. His parents had been searching in the wrong location. But finding his car did nothing to explain what happened to him. The discovery raised an even bigger question. How did Brandon become so confused about where he was? Using details from the phone call, investigators began piecing together his route. The picture that emerged was of a young man crossing fence lines, walking through open fields, and moving further into the countryside as he searched for a town he wasn't actually approaching. With a better understanding of where Brandon had actually been that night, search efforts intensified. Law enforcement officers, volunteers, search dogs, and even helicopters were brought in to search the surrounding area. Investigators focused heavily on the route that Brandon was believed to have taken after leaving his vehicle. At first, many believed it would only be a matter of time before he was found. But as days passed, the search produced almost nothing. Searchers found no confirmed trace of Brandon. No clothing, no personal belongings, no sign of a struggle. Nothing that clearly explained what happened after the phone call ended. One of the most significant areas searched was the Yellow Medicine River, a winding waterway that crossed the area where Brandon likely traveled through. Investigators considered the possibility that Brandon may have actually fallen into the river after losing his footing in the middle of the night. Yet investigators found nothing to suggest Brandon had actually entered the river. The area where Brandon disappeared was rural, but it wasn't endless wilderness. It was farmland. Roads cut through the landscape. Farmhouses and buildings were scattered across the countryside. It should have been difficult for anyone to simply vanish. The most widely accepted explanation is that Brandon suffered some type of accident. Perhaps he slipped while crossing rough terrain, or perhaps he fell into a concealed hole, drainage ditch, or an abandoned well. Another possibility is that Brandon had encountered someone. Given the rural location and the time of night, foul play appears unlikely. However, it cannot be completely ruled out. Nearly 2 decades later, one question still remains unanswered. What caused Brandon Swanson to utter the words, "Oh shit!" just moments before he disappeared? The reality is, nobody knows. But his family has never stopped searching for answers. They leave the porch light on every night, hoping that one day Brandon will find his way home.